Our brains are absolutely amazing things, and sometimes it's helpful to think about them in terms of the way they respond particularly when we're frightened. There are three main parts that we need to think about when we're thinking about the brain. There's the brain stem, which I'm pointing at the back of my head because it's right down in there. And this is the only part of the brain that's really fully developed when we're born, and it governs all of the bits of us that we don't have to think about. Like, for example, making sure that our heart keeps beating and that we digest our food. And then the next part of the brain that develops in the first few years of life, that's the bit that sort of governs our emotions and how we respond when we're under threat. So that's a very important part when we're thinking about children who have experienced a lot of frightening things in their lives. And then we've got this bit, the prefrontal cortex, that gives us a big forehead. That's the bit that does all of our thinking and all of our organising. It's the bit that makes sure that we've get to our appointments on time, and we remember to pack our sandwiches if we're going to be out all day. And it's the big thinking human part of our brain. Now, when we're scared, when something happens that is a threat to us, the amygdala, which is a small almond-shaped piece of brain right inside, takes over. It's our alarm system, and it only has one job, and that job is to keep us safe and to protect us. And it does that by, first of all, brilliantly, it floods the other parts of our brain with chemicals that stop this thinking part from working. And it does that because it doesn't want us to think, it wants us just to act and get safe. So this is why when somebody is very distressed and frightened, actually trying to talk to them and reason with them isn't going to work, because they haven't got this thinking part of their brain available. The amygdala's taken over, and it's got 5 options. Most of us are aware of fight or flight, so it does lots of things in our body. It triggers us to release hormones and chemicals that will help us to do those 2 things, that will help us to run away quickly or to be strong and square up to the threat. It also can cause us to do flop or freeze. Freeze is often, I think, of the rabbit caught in the headlights. You're driving down a country lane and an animal runs out in front of you in the dark, and it just stands there. You think, get out of the way, but it doesn't. That's a very good example of a freeze. And we see that and the flop very commonly in children. Flop is where, in its most extreme sense, it's where you can actually just kind of collapse, pass out, sometimes lose control of your bodily functions. And this happens when people are very, very scared. These 2 are particularly common for children because a lot of the threats for children who come into care have been the threats of the people that they're living with. And if we think about a small person, possibly 2 or 3 foot tall, and a big grown-up, 5, possibly 6 feet tall, they haven't really got the option to run or to fight. So the amygdala chooses the best option available to it, and that's often the flop or the freeze. And then the last one that I mentioned, friend. This is a strange one to think about, but actually, again, it's one that we see children using an awful lot, and people who are in positions where they are likely to be overwhelmed or overpowered. What it involves is that trying to get close to the threat, and as I'm saying, children who come into care, the threat is normally a person. So it means trying to approach that person and get them on your side to try to reduce the danger that they present to you. And we see children sometimes gravitating towards the people who we know are a threat to them and that we worry about. And this is a very good example of where their amygdala is using the friend strategy in order to try and keep them safe. So what I would say about this is it's important for us to understand that these are the strategies that our amygdala is using. It's also important for us to realise that if a child comes into care and has had a lot of frightening things happen in their life, their amygdala is probably very, very sensitive. It's a bit like it's been turned right up. And so they will perceive threat where maybe it doesn't exist. So a very common example is if foster carers are having crosswords, or maybe are feeling that they need to tell off a child, that child may well be triggered. Their amygdala may well start to fire, their thinking brain will shut down, and you will see them respond with one of those strategies. And this often underpins a lot of the behaviour that we describe as challenging behaviour, a lot of the behaviour we find difficult to manage. It's actually a child just responding to being terrified in the moment. So thinking about children, particularly children who present with what we would describe as aggression, rather than thinking of them as angry children, it's often very helpful to think of them as scared children. So we need to know that this is something that can happen. And we also need to know that when children's amygdalas are firing, the one job that we really have is to try and encourage them to calm and to settle. So using short phrases, it's okay, you are safe, we're going to be all right, this is all going to work out. Those sort of phrases to calm them down, so that then you can try and get this big thinking part of their brain back on track. And at that point, you can start to talk about what's happening.